Everybody. We are starting the second day of the 12th meeting of the Italian Society for Neuroethics and Philosophy of Neuroscience. And we'll have a session that will start with the talk by Derk Pereboom, who will be awarded with the SINe medal, that's second only to the Nobel Prize at this point. And then we'll have two talks by Thomas Søbirk and Jesper Ryberg before having having no break, just going directly to the parallel session. So let me say something about our awarded speaker. I'm sorry, I've lost everything here. I want to share the screen because I have a presentation. Derk Pereboom is Susan Linsage Professor of Philosophy at Cornell University. And let's start that way, sorry. And he was born actually in Europe, in the Netherlands, in the little village of Pesse. I don't know the pronunciation. As everyone knows, Dutch pronunciation is difficult. So sorry, I would like to, I don't know what to do here. Okay, let's go. Okay, so I wrote here the title of this presentation, Beyond Freedom and Retribution. Of course, it's a mention of a way of paraphrasing the famous book by Skinner, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Freedom meant as free will. Also, Derk has forcefully defended the idea that we do not enjoy free will, even if he wouldn't buy the idea of Skinner that we don't have dignity, but certainly is against retribution as a theory of punishment. Let me say, present some of the main ideas of our speaker today. Let's try to, okay. So I was saying that Derk is both Dutch and American, and he's very, if I can say, he's very proud of his Dutch origins. And actually, I would say also that, sorry, he's also the second most famous Dutch philosopher, and he also connects to the first most famous Dutch philosopher, so Spinoza. There are similarities there. And Derk stresses the fact that his ideas about free will, or the illusion of, are similar to the ones defended by Spinoza in the 1600s. Here is some other, this is Derk in a moment of concentration, thinking about philosophy. And first of all, one of the many fields that Derk covers is consciousness, where it defends a very interesting position that is a combination of non-reductive physicalism, non-functionalist physicalism, illusionism about the qualia and material constitution. Or for non-philosophers, probably this is cannot be understood. But I grant you that these are very interesting and original views, especially putting them together. Notice as the stress on illusionism about the qualia, not dissimilar from what Daniel Dennett defended. And, but especially Derk is very famous for his ideas about free will. Notice the title of the first book, Living Without Free Will. So the idea that Derk has that free will is a metaphysical idea that's empty or false, no, perhaps false. There is not such a thing in the natural world. We don't have any argument for defending free will. Let's say that. It's not that Derk doesn't give a priori argument completely a priori. There are some parts that are empirical, especially when it denies the possibility of agents causation. But anyway, the idea is that we don't have free will, and consequently, we don't have moral responsibility as we would like to think, and actually as the tradition had thought for millennia. So no free will, no moral responsibility, not responsibility in the sense of ultimate responsibility, and no merit. And but is there a meaning of life? The answer here is yes. Derk is not radically pessimistic. He's only saying that there are not things like free will and responsibility, but it's actually good for, in some respects, to realize these things. Whereas there are others in philosophy that think that discovering that we don't have free will is a bad thing. Derk has a different opinion. It's a very good thing to know that we don't have free will, because one of the main consequences is that we can reformulate, rethink completely our ideas of punishment. Why should the society or the state or the government punish some of its citizens, and why? So the only the idea of punishment that Derk has is totally disconnected from ideas like responsibility, merit, desert. It's connected with the idea of quarantine. You know, we know this word now from the epidemics, but the idea is that people who commit crimes weren't committing them out of free will, because such a thing doesn't exist. So they are not ultimately responsible for what they did. There is no sense in saying that they would merit what they did, any punishment for what they did. So the only idea is that we should treat them humanly, because like we treat people with a disease or with a contagious disease. So quarantine is the way of thinking about punishment. Of course, there is also a positive consequence of that. There is no positive merit in the strong sense. No one really merits what they do in the sense of the tradition, that someone did something good or heroic out of free will, and so is responsible for what they did. That's not the idea. This punishment have to be thought in the perspective that they can be useful for the future. Okay, punishing people is useful, so they will learn, they will become better citizens, and giving prizes to people or praising people is a good way, because they will be incentivized to do well again, and so will other people. That's more or less the idea of that Derk has. Notice that this denial of free will is also typical of Calvinism, and being from the Netherlands, Derk is close to Calvinism. It's actually, at least when we thought about that, is a Calvinist. And as you know, Calvinists are deny free will. Calvin himself wrote a famous book called De Predestinazione, on predestination. So there is no such a thing as free will for Calvin and for Derk also. And this is a connection with some interest that Derk has in philosophy of religion. By the way, Derk studied at the famous Calvin College before going to UCLA for the PhD. Calvin College is the best Calvinist school in America. So it is an interesting connection, putting together religion and a secular view on philosophy and reaching the same conclusion. There is no such a thing as free will. And also, finally, let me say something. This is the last book by Derk, Wrongdoing and the Moral Emotions, that is coming out for Oxford University Press. You notice this drawing by another famous Dutch. This is Rembrandt, of course. And so again, it's connected with a notion like wrongdoing. How can you account for wrongdoing if you don't believe in free will and responsibility? And what is the connection with moral emotions? That's an issue very important for people who study neuroethics, of course. Now, this is, we are very happy to give the SINe Prize to Derk. But it is the first time we have given this, the prize to, the prize for philosophy has been given in the past to Ned Block, Daniel Dennett, Adina Roski, Tim Crane, Diego Marconi, and Al Milley. But this is the first time that we give this prize to a person who doesn't deserve it, in the sense that no one, of course, there is no such a thing as desert. Still, it will be very useful to give this prize to Derk Pereboom, because people will be inspired by his example. So Andrea, please show the magnificent prize. I don't know where Andrea is. That will be delivered transoceanically. Yeah, okay. That's spectacular. There are no typos, that's perfect. And so we are very happy. So thank you very much. Let's do a virtual clap for our speaker. And now please, Derk, it's your turn.
Great. Thank you very much for that, for this very generous award. I'm very grateful to the Italian Society for Neuroethics for bestowing this award on me. It's a real honor. And thank you, Mario, for that very informative and generous introduction. And thank all of you for attending this session and this talk. So I have a handout and I will share the screen. Now you can tell me if can you actually see my handout now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to give this talk. So Mario's right. You know, I deny free will in the sense of the control in action required for moral responsibility that involves what I call basic desert. But that allows for another kind of moral responsibility, a kind of moral responsibility that's solely forward-looking, as Mario also indicated. And it turns out that there are different views here, different possible forward-looking views. And in recent months, actually, there's the controversy between people who hold my kind of view, including my collaborator down the road here, Greg Caruso. Greg has been involved in a dialogue with Daniel Dennett on this issue, because Daniel Dennett also holds a forward-looking position on moral responsibility, which differs significantly from the position that Greg Caruso and I argue for. So that issue kind of frames the debate, but the broader objective of this talk is to say something about the kind of moral responsibility that I, in fact, want to endorse, and why my particular forward-looking conception is advantageous. Okay? And in the process, I'll cite some very interesting recent studies on the notion of the backfire effect, which has been actually quite prominent in recent electoral politics here in the United States. Okay, so the kind of moral responsibility that I want to deny, so-called ultimate moral responsibility, I define in terms of the notion of basic desert. And in this most recent book, Wrongdoing and the Moral Emotions, I have a kind of a revised statement of what that comes to. And here I was helped out by my opponent, Michael McKenna. And so let's see if I can actually see the screen here. So for an agent to be morally responsible for an action in this basic desert sense is for the action to be attributable to the agent in such a way that if she was sensitive to its being morally wrong, she would deserve to be blamed or punished in a way that she would experience as painful or harmful. And if she was sensitive to its being morally exemplary, then she deserved to be praised or rewarded in a way that she would experience as pleasurable or beneficial. So in this version of the notion of basic desert, I tie to pain and harm on the one hand, and pleasure and benefit on the other. So what's basic about this notion of desert? And the basicality of this notion of desert is going to contrast with the view that Dennett holds, as well as the person that I'll actually highlight in this talk, Manuel Vargas, because he holds a view similar to Dennett's. So the deserted issue is basic in the sense that the agent, to be morally responsible, would deserve such blame and punishment, praise, or reward, just in virtue of having performed the action with sensitivity to its moral status, and not, for example, by virtue of consequentialist or contractualist considerations. Okay, so why reject this notion of basic desert? Well, Mario put the two books up on the screen there, Living Without Free Will and Free Will, Agency and Meaning of Life. And in those two books, I argue that we don't have the sort of control and action required for attributions of basic desert. So first, to basically deserve to be blamed or punished in a way that imposes pain or harm, an agent must have a kind of control and action, a type of free will that's unavailable to us. And, you know, I don't want to recount the arguments here, but I do want to say that, you know, yesterday's talk by Carl Desseroth, I mean, you know, that the possibility there of this sort of intervention is to my mind actually remarkable, and he does you know, up to genetic neural stimulation. And he did note in his talk that his students at Stanford are actually very disturbed by this. And I got to say that that's also true. People here in our neurobiology department here, we also do this sort of work. And there's actually some colleagues of mine that have patented some processes of this sort. And when people hear about it, I find that they just they want to forget about it. They don't want to acknowledge it because I think it is disturbing. But on the other hand, even though the possibility of this, you know, very fine-grained optogenetic neural stimulation with these very dramatic effects is in fact possible. As Caro pointed out yesterday, it doesn't actually settle the free will issue, although it frames it in interesting ways, and I think that that's correct. Okay, so independently of the free will issue, there is a question an ethical question that's really separate from the question of free will, whether harm or pain can ever qualify as a non-instrumental good, okay, as it would have to if there was such a thing as basic desert. And these reasons to deny basic desert can be conjoined with an epistemic concern that I've pushed ever since 2001. And that's this: it really comes from the legal context. So justification for imposing harm must meet a high epistemic standard. So for example, if we're gonna, in the United States, we still have the death penalty, but if you're gonna mete out the death penalty for murder, it has the justification has to be beyond reasonable doubt. Okay? And so this illustrates this moral idea that we have, that justification for imposing harm must meet a high epistemic standard. And if it's significantly probable that one's justification is unsound, then at least prima facie, that imposition of harm is wrong. Okay? So maybe that lets in basically the deserved praise or benefit or pleasure, but it does count, I think, pretty significantly against basically deserved pain or harm. Okay, so what are the alternatives? So my colleague Sean Nichols here, as well as Tim Scanlon, argues that there is such a thing as basic desert, but it's kind of a minor consideration. So Sean Nichols argues that retribution does in fact lack a rational foundation. In fact, he just told me the other day that when he was, you know, in college, he decided that we didn't have free will. So he has the same view as I do, but he doesn't think that retribution or negative basic desert needs a rational foundation, because there are a lot of factors in our ethical mindset that lack a rational foundation. But he does agree that retributive norms are weak because retributive norms have to compete with a very general anti-harm principle. You know, Scanlon has a similar view in an article that on basic desert that he authored in 2013. And in the end, he wants to say that basic desert can only justify the withdrawal of goodwill and can't actually justify the imposition of harm as punishment. Okay? So that's one alternative. But in the end, I think Sean he thinks that the major moral considerations have to set aside the notion of basically deserved harm or pain. Okay, so what about views that reject basic desert? Now, it's interesting that in this new dialogue book with Greg Caruso, Just Deserts, which came out at the very end of 2020, I think you're probably aware of that, right? Maybe it's even translated into Italian by now. I mean, it definitely has made the rounds. I mean, what he says is that the idea of negative basic desert or retribution is reprehensible. Okay, it's reprehensible. So he thinks it's not only a mistaken moral idea, but he thinks it's a very bad moral idea from the ethical point of view. But he nonetheless, as is very clear in this book with Greg, this dialogue book with Greg Caruso, he does defend the idea of desert, but for him, desert is not basic. Okay? So it's non-basic desert. So where does this come from? Although I got to say that, you know, I had a little interaction with Dennett just recently about this idea, and I think he doesn't like to be called a non-basic desert theorist, but we'll have to see what alternative he provides as a characterization of his view. Okay, so at least in our era, the idea of non-basic desert comes from John Rawls. So John Rawls, when he was in our department here at Cornell, published this article called an article which presents a two-tier theory. Okay? It's called Two Concepts of Rules. And it's a two-tier theory in which, and it's a theory about the law, not about morality generally, but about legal practice. So on this view, you have on the one hand, legal justifications for criminal punishment. And those legal justifications, as they're conceived by lawyers and judges and juries, so participants in the legal practice, are thought of as entirely backward looking, okay? So involving desert. But at the same time, at a higher level or a higher tier, this whole practice is justified on the basis of consequentialist considerations or even utilitarian considerations. So utilitarianism at the higher level, desert at the lower level. Sometimes this is called government house utilitarianism. It's a variety of government house utilitarianism in which the practitioners don't think of their practice as justified by virtue of consequences. Only the philosophers are aware of that, right? The people on the ground think of their practice as justified in terms of notions like desert. Okay, so this idea is extended to the entire practice of holding morally responsible by Daniel Dennett, maybe kind of implicitly in 1984, more explicitly in the book with Greg in 2020. By Manuel Vargas, implicitly in his 2013 book, Building Better Beings. But then when prodded by my colleague, John Doris, in a book symposium in philosophical studies in 2015, he acknowledged that he's a two-tier non-basic desert theorist. Okay, so and it's Manuel's position that I want to focus on because it's conservative. I mean, we had this altercation once in Tucson in which he admitted that his view was conservative about the moral practice. And this is before 2015, but then he wrote all this up in this response to Doris, and I'll give you some choice quotes from Vargas on the conservatism of his position. Okay, so what's the background of the conservatism? Well, if you think of the conception of moral practice that is advocated by, say, David Hume in both the treatise and the inquiry, or by his friend Adam Smith, later by P.F. Strawson, also by Edmund Burke, the famous British conservative, Edmund Burke. So we have this idea of a moral practice, and the idea is that it's very closely tied to a kind of fixed human nature. So we human beings have a fixed human nature. It's not especially malleable, maybe malleable in some very minor respects. And our practice of holding morally responsible, especially with the reactive attitudes, as Strawson called them, like indignation, resentment, and guilt, is an expression of this invariable human nature that all of us possess. But at the same time, it's it's kind of a sanguine view about the practice because it's a salutary practice according to all of these figures, a complex system that, given our natures, does fine work in regulating human actions, attitudes, and dispositions to the benefit of all. There's room for some change in the practice, but justified change is decidedly limited. Okay, and so Dennett, I think, would resist the conservatism. Okay, that's, I think, the difference between Dennett and Vargas. But maybe the two-tier view is inherently conservative in this respect. I mean, that's something we can think about. But Vargas actually endorses the conservative side of the conservative version of the two-tier view. So he says in 2015, despite the potentially revisionist nature of this approach, revisionist to the extent that the result of prescriptive philosophical theorizing conflicts with folk commitments, the project is fundamentally conservative. On this approach, the main issue is whether our existing practices, or something very much like them, are justified and whether typical judgments of moral responsibility are true. Okay, now he allows for some revision, but not for much. He's got the example of, in the United States, we have the state of Texas, which is known for its conservative legal practice. So he says, I've argued that the crucial issue is whether there are many or any cases where our practices and judgments are such that my position cannot provide an adequate normative basis. It's not clear what such a case would be. Yet let us suppose that there are some such cases. Perhaps, for example, Texas-style death penalty attitudes and the practices cannot persist without some form of desert that cannot be recast along the two-tiered lines I've endorsed. If so, it's difficult to see how these cases could be widespread. Okay, so now Vargas thinks that the main forward-looking point of the practice is to, as the title of his book indicates, to build better beings. And so you might wonder whether inflicting the Texas-style death penalty actually serves to build better beings. There's a question about that. At least the being who's being executed, you might think that his being isn't built by virtue of that execution. But anyway, you might think that it has a good effect on other people. Maybe that's what Manuel has in mind. Okay, so I contend that the two-tier nature of the position facilitates the conservatism. Why is that? Because this allows, as in Rawls's view, the ground level practice to be insulated, at least to a significant degree, from the forward-looking considerations, because the practitioners don't have the forward-looking considerations in mind. And so they're not sensitive to facts about the world that would engage those forward-looking considerations. So the practitioners are thinking only in backward-looking terms, not in forward-looking terms. So whatever reasons there are out there, facts out there that would engage the forward-looking reasons are kind of closed off to the practitioners on this sort of view. Dennett's view is a bit different because I think he thinks the practice as a whole can be revised. But, you know, even in the book with Greg, he doesn't have a very detailed account about how the practice would be revised. And you know, you might consider this to be an issue for his view. Now, by contrast, on the undivided alternative, those who blame legitimately have the forward-looking objectives in mind. Which are they? Okay, from the one hand, building better beings. Okay, the moral formation. So I concur with Manuel that that's a key objective of the practice. Also have reconciliation in relationships, and that's something that Scanlon emphasizes in his moral theory. Also protection, you know, protection. So we have the right to defensive harm and defensive threat. That's something that I emphasize in my view, that Greg emphasizes in his, and that's another forward-looking aim of the practice of holding morally responsible. Okay, there are three. And they're not the only three, but perhaps they're the most prominent three forward-looking aims of the practice. And so in my view, in the undivided view, the practitioners have these forward-looking objectives in mind, okay? In blaming and at least in the blaming practice, but also in the praising practice. So at least so as a result, they don't impose pain and harm conceived as deserved, but rather as having these forward-looking goals. Okay, so now returning to the Dennett-Vargas scheme. So they're both consequentialists about the practice, and it's, you know, there are various kinds of utilitarianisms or consequentialisms. You know, there's act utilitarianism, consequentialism, the rule version, the motive version. This is, I see it as a kind of practice level consequentialism. So what we do here is we compare the various possible practices of holding morally responsible that are available to us, and we pick the one that works best. And Manuel, I know this from conversations with him, Manuel Vargas thinks that the one we actually have works best. Okay? It does the best at building better beings. So why does he think this? Have we tried some other ones? Well, maybe this is what the conservative consists in. There's a kind of conviction that, you know, our practice is really good. Now, so that's one. The idea is that the practice is salutary or a good one at achieving the relevant forward-looking goals. But this is conjoined with the idea that human nature isn't malleable, that we can't change much. Yeah, you know, there's science fiction stories about people who adopt a different sort of practice, but we're not such people, because our natures aren't malleable. So there are two concerns here that I want to address. One is the claim that human nature isn't malleable, and the other is that the practice works really well. It's a salutary practice, and I want to at least contest both claims. both claims that are explicit in Vargas and perhaps implicit in Dennett. Okay, so just to summarize a bit, so a general concern for the two-tier view is that that actual practice will be insufficiently responsive to the forward-looking aims that are held to justify it, and that for this reason, an undivided view is to be preferred. Okay? Now here's a kind of theoretical advantage of the undivided view. The undivided view also features a direct and transparent connection between reason's responsiveness and the forward-looking notion of responsibility. While I want to say a similar tie is lacking for desert invoking more responsibility. Now, all my compatibilist friends who believe in basic desert, like John Fisher and Michael McKenna and Carolina Sartorio, Dan and Nelkin, David Brink, they're all advocates of basic desert. And they're also advocates of the reason's responsiveness criterion for the attributability of desert invoking responsibility. And I want to say that there's no transparent connection between reason's responsiveness and desert, but there is a transparent connection between reason's responsiveness and my notion of responsibility. Because on my notion of responsibility, on the undivided view, what you do to the wrongdoer is you present the wrongdoer with, in blaming a wrongdoer, you present a wrongdoer with reasons for forbearing from that type of behavior, and perhaps extinguishing or at least diminishing the disposition to do wrong. Okay? So blaming, in my view, is centrally a reasons-giving activity and not a desert-attributing activity. And so it makes sense that the criterion for blameworthiness on this forward-looking view would be reasons responsiveness, whereas it makes maybe a little less sense on the view of my basic desert-invoking compatibilist colleagues. Okay. So, first of all, variability. Now, like I said, I mean, P.F. Strawson's an interesting case because he does say that, you know, when we think about consequentialist reasons for blaming and praising and perhaps revising our practice, he said, you got to keep in mind that our blaming and praising activities are expressions of our nature. Right? Now, but this requires that we have a nature that is relatively fixed, at least fixed to the degree that no matter what, the reactive attitudes will turn out to be expressions of that nature. Now, is this really the case? You know, there's a lot of social psychology on this, and in a kind of a big survey by three social psychologists, Josephine Delaire-Snyder, Michael Boiger, and Bacha Mesquita from 2013. So they survey a lot of studies that indicate that human nature is significantly variable. And in particular, that cultures vary significantly in how they regulate the emotions. And they have some really nice examples of differences between East Asia and China in particular, and the United States and Europe as far as emotional regulation goes, and also expression of emotions. But you know, one of the most dramatic examples of all is you know, Jean Briggs. She's an anthropologist who in 1970 went up to way up in northern Canada, Nunavut, what's now the Nunavut territory, and lived with the Utku-Hik-Saling-Mute Inuit of Canada's Nunavut territory. So they used to be called Eskimos. What's very interesting about that community is that from a very early age, children are not taught not to express anger. And at least within the culture, anger is very rarely expressed in interactions among people anyway. Maybe it's a bit different for animals, but among people in the community, anger is very rarely expressed. And our three authors take this as evidence for at least variability of human nature as far as emotional expression goes. Okay, so that's some evidence for variability in first of all, emotional regulation among cultures, but also in kind of the possibilities for human emotional expression, how they vary across cultures. Okay, so what about this idea that the practice works really well? And Manuel says, you know, I mean, there's some examples of maybe the practice not being all that great, like in Texas, in the attitude toward criminals. But is that really the case? Okay, so first of all, you know, if you think about human relationships and how often human relationships are undermined by expressions of the negative reactive attitudes, okay, such as resentment, right, in the case of personal wrongdoing, or indignation, the third person analog to what Strawson calls moral resentment. Okay, and so there are studies on this as well. I cite one here by Bates and J.E. Bates and colleagues. I mean, indicates that when parents confront their teenagers, teenagers, they're in the process of moral formation. When they misbehave, there are various sorts of reactions you can have toward blaming reactions you can have toward the teenagers, but often where they're angry and resentful or indignant, what results is an impairment of the relationship where that's not really needed. The way I see it, that often it's the case that angry confrontation at least tends to give the target just a couple of options. One is humiliation, and the other is resistance. Right? So you have possibility of humiliation, the possibility of resistance, but when reconciliation, when reform and reconciliation is the objective, you don't want either resistance or humiliation, right? You want reconciliation. So I think that's one way in which the practice, at least as Strawson characterizes it, in terms of the prevalence of these reactive attitudes such as indignation and resentment, that's one way it can malfunction. Okay? And once you think about it, it often malfunctions in this way because there are many, many cases in our society of impaired relationships between parents and adolescent and teenage children. Okay, now here's another kind of obvious case, maybe not so much in Italy, but in the United States. If you think about the practice of holding morally responsible in the political context, especially in recent years, say in the last 4 or 5 years, it seems that the main purpose of blame is to disempower. Okay? So the idea isn't, blame doesn't have the purpose of regulating behavior, at least doesn't seem to have that purpose. Rather, it has the power to get people voted out of office, right? And it's pretty rampant. I mean, it's amazing. And not only, at least from my point of view, there's a lot of accusations are made up in order to disempower people. And this calls to mind kind of the Nietzschean critique of what he thinks of as Judeo-Christian morality and the genealogy of morals, where the idea is that there are really two views that are interwoven. On the one hand, the idea of impartial morality. On the other hand, the will to power. And, maybe Nietzsche is right to the extent that people have a hard time keeping apart those two objectives. The impartiality, being impartial, treating people impartially and with respect on the one hand, and the will to power on the other. And of course, this has been a theme in the work of Michel Foucault, who is a tremendous pessimist about our practice of holding morally responsible, broadly construed. But also Spinoza. Spinoza is also worried about it. He thinks there's too much anger in our practice, and he doesn't quite have the sort of genealogical critique that we see in Nietzsche and later in Foucault, but still he's very critical of the practice as it actually exists. Okay, so what are the reasons why the practice malfunctions? So one reason it malfunctions perhaps is we had Mark Alecki from Ohio University over here, and he gave a great talk on this. He's been working on this for like 25 years or so. Actually, he was tragically killed in his backyard by a falling tree just before the election. Very sad because his material is great. So he and his associates have argued over the past 25 years or so that subjects who evaluate the actions of others unfavorably and blame them as a result tend to exaggerate the putative wrongdoer's causal control and evidence, my favorite, while at the same discounting the counter evidence. Okay? Now, one way in which relationships, I want to argue that for relationships to work well, when participants in the relationship do wrong, it's really important that the interlocutors believe the truth about the wrongdoing. And if it's the case that these attitudes that Strawson highlights, indignation and resentment, have a tendency to distort the truth, that's a serious problem with the practice. So what's at stake here? So my student, one of my students is writing on this, and he suggests that anger is part of the problem here. And there are quite a few studies that indicate that anger, particularly, moral anger particularly, degrades reasoning in the way that Alecki studies suggest. So Jennifer Lerner, Julie Goldberg, Paul Litvak, they've done studies along these lines. And in their view, in a survey article of Goldberg's, the results that are recounted is that anger results in a tendency to overlook circumstances that would serve to mitigate blame, enhances the disposition to view ambiguous behavior as hostile, strengthens the proclivity to rely on stereotypes about irrelevant features such as race and ethnicity, and heightens the probability of agents discounting the role of uncontrollable factors in assessing responsibility for wrongdoing. So Julie Goldberg and her associates in one of their studies conclude that when retributive desires to harm are not satisfied, anger activates an indiscriminate tendency to punish others in related situations without regard for whether their actions were intentional. Okay? So anger, the reactive attitudes tend to have this, the negative reactive attitudes tend to have this distorting effect, which actually undermines at least one of the points of the practice of holding morally responsible in the context of human relationships. Okay, so let me highlight this backfire effect. So I was introduced to it by a couple of my colleagues here at Cornell, who were in the government department, Sarah Krebs. Sarah Krebs is the main author of the study. So what they did was so recently, we had this election, and a lot of people on the Trump side believed that the election was stolen or fraudulent. And so what they attempted to do was to correct people who thought this, or at least in their minds. So the idea was to say, you're really mistaken in thinking that the election was fraudulent and stolen, and here are the reasons why. And they actually found that among people who initially believed, or at least had a pretty high credence in the claim that the election was stolen, this intervention has increased that credence by an average of 14%. Okay, so this is an instance of the backfire effect. So, Feike Harenk and Gerben van Cleef, they have a study on the backfire effect and its relation to anger. Okay? A number of studies, actually. So what they argue is that when two people are involved in a conflict about their interests, anger can be effective, at least in the short term. But when people are conflict about values, as they tend to in political contexts, when values, norms, and identity expressions are at issue, that's when anger occasions the backfire effect. And in their view, the backfire effect is an outcome in which value beliefs targeted for revision are strengthened and not weakened by the interaction. So their studies provide evidence that people regard expressions of anger as more unfair in value conflicts than in interest conflicts, and also that we're more likely to engage in retaliatory responses when confronted with an angry attempted refutation in a value conflict. Okay, so I think the people that originated the term, the backfire effect, are Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler. They did so in 2008, but they have a number of studies and analyses of this effect. And they characterize the backfire effect as an identity protective action that responds to belief-threatening refutation messages in a way that results in higher credence in the targeted belief. So how do you counter the backfire effect? So Gregory Travers and his associates proposed and tested the following: that to counter the backfire effect, messages be framed in ways that activate self-conceptions amenable to processing the message with the intended revision. So this example. So if you're trying to educate people about the safety, suppose you believe that genetically modified foods are safe, and you're trying to educate people in this respect. So if you frame this attempted belief revision by information about which foods are natural and which are unnatural, then self-conceptions regarding valuation of dietary purity may be activated, and that would trigger the backfire effect. However, if such communication is instead framed by the value of feeding the world's hungry, self-conceptions relating to generosity and compassion stand to be activated, precluding that effect or avoiding that effect, and increasing the likelihood of belief revision. Okay. So this suggests that in political discourse, framing communication with shared values and common social economic concerns may, in certain contexts, achieve value change and avoid the backfire effect. The effect is not, this intended change isn't always attainable. Perhaps such strategies will achieve enough mutual understanding to resolve the extreme, say, political discord we now see. So bringing this back to the undivided view. So, look, I think my undivided view claims that it's very important for participants in the practice of holding morally responsible, in particular when they're blaming, to have the forward-looking objectives in mind. And the backfire effect is a very nice illustration of this. So if you're on Vargas's side and you're only thinking about what people who hold bad values and bad beliefs deserve, then you're not going to be sensitive to the kinds of considerations that trigger the backfire effect. Right? So if what you want here is people to change their minds in a certain way, in a way that's salutary, then you want to be aware of the forward-looking considerations. And you don't want to be thinking just in terms of what these people deserve. If you think in terms of what these people deserve, you'll also just tend to be angry with them and express your anger with them, which, and the problem with that is that if you want to get, switch 5% of the political spectrum over to your side, just being angry with people and conceiving of them as deserving harm or pain is not going to realize that objective. So this is one context in which the undivided forward-looking view is to be preferred. I think it's also true in the context of like intimate personal relationships with children. When you're dealing with teenagers who are behaving badly, I think it's really important to have the forward-looking goals in mind, especially moral formation, reconciliation. If you just have desert in mind, and there's no barrier to the kind of anger, indignation that the backward-looking considerations recommend, then you stand to lose out on the possibility of forward-looking goals such as reconciliation, moral formation. Okay, now that may be the case for personal relationships. You still might think that in the Rawls type context, the two-tier view is okay. That Dennett's view is right in purely legal context. I'm kind of open to that, not quite, but in the end, I guess I want to say, even though I'm pretty opposed to Manuel's view because it's conservative, I'm less opposed to Dennett's view when it comes to legal practice, in particular because he himself argues that penalty law should be sensitive to the forward-looking considerations. And so he's not conservative about penalty law when it comes to these legal contexts. And at least I see that my view, it's not the view I prefer because I'd rather not think of in terms of desert at all, but I see some possibility of reconciliation with Dennett on this score. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Derk. That was illuminating. I don't know, I'll ask Andrea, Sarah, how much time we have for questions, because we still have 2 talks. No one is there. Andrea?
I'm here. I'll take a few questions, not more than that.
Okay, a few is one of the most vague.
I know.
A few is, I think a few is 2.
Two short questions.
And it can be stretched to 3.
Okay. So are there questions? People could raise their hands or put a question in the chat. If no one asks questions, I'll ask one. Derk, you talk about the 2-tier theory of punishment in which there is justification is backward looking and practices are forward looking on consequentialist grounds. And there is also the other way around that is represented by Hart, in which the justification is only given in utilitarian terms. And in the distribution of punishment, then you consider a negative retribution. So you should never punish someone who doesn't deserve it, and you should never punish someone too much just because this is useful. And this is very different from the other way around, because this goes in the good direction for justice, right? Yes. And so what about that?
Yeah, okay, good. So that is a potential benefit of retributivism, because retributivism does specify a limit on punishment, right? Typically conceived, because after all, it's eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And so you can't take a life for a tooth, so to speak, right? So, so you got that limitation. And so the question is, can you recoup? So kind of a broader question for the kind of view that I advocate, and Greg Caruso, for example, just advocates, is whether we can justify the same sort of intuitively correct limitation on the severity of punishment. Okay, but let me say one thing about that. I think that the Hart view, which is advocated by some other people as well on the scene nowadays, I mean, perhaps it has that consequence. But one problem is that I'd say almost no one thinks that retribution is the only justification for the way we treat criminals, and that almost everybody thinks that protection is also a goal. And I'll give you an illustration from Texas law. I mean, this is actually on the Hart side. So when I was writing Living Without Free, I was reading the newspaper, and there's some guy in Texas who was guilty of some sort of sexual predatory offense, and he was sentenced to 10 years in Texas jail. Okay? The 10 years are up, and he said to the Texas authorities, you know, I haven't changed at all. If I go out there, I'm going to be a sexual predator. Keep me in jail. And the Texan said, no, you've paid for your crime, you're leaving. So that's an interesting case of but I think most jurisdictions in the United States would say that the state also has a role to protect people from sexual predators. And certainly even though the American population is quite retributivist, when it comes to sexual predators, they want to be protected from them. So I want to say that, you know, that at least when it comes to people in the United States, they also have protection as a goal. And people are generally willing to allow the goal of protection to trump, even though we can't really use this term anymore, to trump what retributivism recommends. Okay, so that's one part of the answer. I mean, it's a complex question, but I do want to say that, you know, one potential difficulty for the kind of view that I advocate about punishment, Greg also wants to advocate, is that that for some kinds of cases, maybe sexual predation, that incapacitation is indefinite. And I want to say that when it comes to sexual predation, a lot of people believe that. Not only even retributivists tend to hold that view, but at the same time, you know, I think that we have to do as much as possible. So protection is one goal, but, you know, rehabilitation, reintegration is another. Yeah, so I do think that my view is vulnerable to that sort of objection, by contrast with kind of uniform retributivism, where the only goal of criminal treatment is retribution. But I want to say that hardly anybody believes that, as is illustrated by our laughing at the Texas case.
Yes, thank you very much. I think Sofia Bonicalzi has a question.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you. So I'm very sympathetic with your forward-looking view, as you know, probably. But there is an argument that I hear sometimes from people who want to defend a basic desert conception. So I just want to ask you what you think about this sort of argument. And the argument is that basic desert is necessary if we want, like, for ethical reasons and not just for its connection with free will. And the idea is that we need basic desert to really treat people as competent moral agent, that we need to use this notion to acknowledge that they are the proper authors of their own actions, while in contrast, forward-looking views are too paternalistic, and they treat people as children that must be taught to be moral, but not as proper and competent moral agents. So I think this argument can be resisted, but since I hear it quite often, I would like to hear your opinion on this.
Yeah, okay, good. So so part of the idea is that we see in Hegel, for example, Hegel says people have the right to be punished by virtue of with the respect to which they're owed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that we respect people primarily by treating them as rational. And this is the Kantian idea as well. So if we treat people as reasons responsive, then as responsive to reasons, then we're treating them with respect. And I think it's the primary way in which we do so. So then to contrast that with the Skinner view that Mario adduced in the introduction. So if you treat someone, for example, with the Ludovico method, like in A Clockwork Orange, right, which is a behavioral method. I mean, that's a way of maybe not treating a person with respect, especially if you do so without the person's consent. Whereas if you present the person with like cognitive therapy, right, which provides people with reasons to behave differently, I think it does treat people with respect. Now you might think that punishing someone retributivistically is another way of treating people with respect. I don't know. I don't have that intuition very strongly. I think the main way we do it is by treating people as rational beings. But suppose that's the case. Then I want to say, if you think about free will, about what kinds of beings we are, I don't know, that even if it's the case that treating people retributivistically would be treating people with respect, my sense is that it's treating people in a way that is contrary to how they really are, to their natures. Right? Because I do think that retributivism does presuppose free will, and I think that there are really good arguments that we don't have that sort of free will. So maybe that's something that we've got to give up. But at the same time, I want to stress that the main way in which we respect people is by treating people as rational.
Thank you very much, Derk. I think it's time. And thank you again. You will receive the incredible prize that the SINe gave you. So
thank you.
Thank you again. And we hope to see you soon in person in Italy again.
Excellent. A wonderful place.
Thank you, Derk. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
So we go to the next two speakers. So the first is Thomas Søbirk Petersen of Roskilde University, who will talk about neurodoping and fairness. You have 20 minutes, Thomas. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And good evening, buonasera to all of you. It's really nice to see all of you. Of course, we would all prefer to be in Milan. But anyway, let me start with sharing my screen. Okay. All right. Can you see the screen right now?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. What I would like to talk about is neurodoping and fairness. First of all, I'd like to say a little bit about what is neurodoping and why this focus on the ethics of neurodoping. And then I would like to present and have a critical discussion of two versions of a fairness-based objections to neurodoping. I mean, there can be several sorts of worries or ethical considerations concerning the use of neurodoping that has to do with the health of people, or with a worry that if we legalize certain kinds of neurodoping, people would feel pressured to use these kind of drugs and methods. Well, I have to move a little bit faster than I have planned. So, well, what is actually neurodoping? I use this specification of it. So it says that the use of drugs or methods that are correctly believed by the athletes, trainers, or doctors to enhance mental capacities in order to improve sports performance. And one example could be cognitive enhancing drugs like Ritalin, which according to some studies can improve our attention span. That is definitely important in a lot of sports. Further down the line, we have cognitive enhancing methods like transcranial direct current stimulation, which according to some studies improve athletic performance by improving exercise tolerance. And I think it's very important that we focus on the ethics of neurodoping. I mean, if you punish people, as Derk talked about before, we need a good justification and in favor of that. So that's why we need to do neuroethics on this subject. Furthermore, it's a very up-to-date, so to speak, topic. Whether TDCS should be added to the prohibited list is currently under discussion by the World Anti-Doping Agency. So this is something that is going on right now. Furthermore, I believe that ethical analysis of the use or possible use of neurodoping in sport is a neglected issue, and that might have something to do that within the field of the ethics of doping, the focus is usually on physical doping, the use of EPO or anabolic steroids. And in the discussion about the ethics of cognitive enhancement, people usually talk about cognitive enhancement in the realms of education or research, etc. So very few talk about it within the world of sport. So here's one argument against the legalization of neurodoping. And this is a social scientist called Kwang-Go Park, who has argued that the use of transcranial direct current stimulation is unfair and should be banned, as only athletes of means would likely benefit from the technique, as there are surely athletes that may be unable to buy these devices. So the idea is here that we, so to speak, will have an unfair competition between the rich and the poor. And generally, we would say that if rich athletes have much better opportunity for achieving the level of athletic skills than poor athletes, the relevant sports discipline is not fair. So here's the argument from Park. Fairness requires that rich and poor athletes have equal opportunities to win. It's a critique of the, so to speak, the social lottery. This should not be influencing who will win a sports competition. And further down the line, the use of neurodoping by athletes result in rich athletes having better opportunities to win than poor athletes. And if if P1 and P2, then the use of neurodoping by athletes should be banned. Those the use of neurodoping by athletes should be banned. Is this a good argument? Think about it, 5 seconds. I think not. First of all, is it true that the use of neurodoping by athletes result in rich athletes having better opportunities to win than poor athletes? Well, not necessarily. I mean, if the use of, for example, TDCS or Ritalin is a cheaper way to improve mental capacities that can enhance sports performance compared to, for example, consulting a sports psychologist, which may be very expensive, then the legalization of, for example, TDCS and Ritalin will increase the equality of opportunities for at least some athletes, namely those, of course, who can afford it to perform best in sport. I mean, we have a parallel in physical doping. People using EPO, can increase their number of red blood cells that will make it easier to transport oxygen to the muscles, so you will be able to endure a lot more during a sports contest. But Ritalin is, EPO is actually pretty cheap compared to living or having access to a high altitude chamber or train high or live high or train low, train in high altitudes. So that is one problem. The other problem is that, well, if there is this difference between the access to these devices or to neurodoping in general, then sports associations or the government could pay for or make access to neurodoping like TDCS. Then no athlete would, all else being equal, be subject to unfairness in not having access to such devices. Furthermore, this is more like a moral problem. It's a problem that has to do with the implication of this view. Ought we, morally speaking, ban neurodoping if only the rich have access to it? No, I would say. This would have radical, problematic, negative implications. I mean, if we should ban, for example, TDCS because the apparatus for this technique costs around $400 US, it seems to follow that we should ban a lot of devices in sport, or even ban some sports. Why is that? Well, because the equipment, but also the cost involved in paying for the access to play these sports and participate in competitions can easily cost more than $400 a year. I have this picture of the Babolat tennis racket that has a microchip inside the grip that can record spin and speed of the ball, and that costs around $400. I mean, just to be a member of a sports club will, in many places, cost about $400 a year, or even a lot more. And what about a lot of sports discipline? I mean, they are also pretty expensive. Take horse riding, sailing, motorsport, etc. If we should not allow these differences between rich and poor people, we should simply also ban these kind of disciplines. And I believe that nobody would really be seriously thinking that that's the way to go. Okay, and then I would like to, Andrea Lavassa has invited me, so I'd like to he has made this thought-provoking paper where he claims that the use of TDCS is unfair because of unequal responsiveness to the use of TDCS, and that none or low responses should then be compensated. Is that a good view? Should we accept that view? Lavassa says that TDCS can create situations of high inequality because its great variability of efficacy means that some people greatly benefit from it and others not at all. This increases inequality, and this leads to a potential undesirable outcome and should be compensated for. Okay, here I have reconstructed the argument as fair as I hope it's a fair reconstruction. But first of all, let us just accept premise P2 and premise P3. I mean, some athletes who use TDCS are less responsive than other athletes who use it. And the use of TDCS is performing enhancing. I know there's a huge discussion about that. So my main critique is of what we could call the compensation principle. First of all, I think the compensation system is hardly workable. I mean, it is far from possible to detect every use of TDCS unless you catch people in the act of using them, unless you catch people red-handed. I mean, so we haven't got any kind of devices that that can tell us whether or not a person has been using these kind of devices. But this is very important because it makes it impossible to distinguish between users and non-users unless we, of course, put all athletes under surveillance 24/7 all year round. And there are good reasons not to do that. That has to do with privacy or whatever we call it. So furthermore, if it is possible to detect the use, of TDCS, each athlete should be tested, and it should be settled how responsive each athlete is to use the TDCS device. And that would also take a lot of effort. I mean, imagine testing all athletes, whether or not they are responsive or not. Maybe you are more responsive one year than another, so you will have to be tested throughout your professional career. And I mean, how should non-responders be compensated? That's a further practical problem. I here have a picture of Matteo Berrettini, the great Italian tennis player. You have so many great tennis players at the moment. You have 10 players in top 100. That's really amazing. But let's say that that Matteo Berrettini is responsive, that he responds well to TDCS, and he's playing against Rafa Nadal, and Rafa Nadal is not responding at all. How should we then compensate in this scenario? Should Matteo Berrettini be down love 15 in each game, or should he be down by 2 games in every set, or how should we do that? And it seems to me that there will be extremely much micromanaging going on here that won't be practically feasible. And finally, and that would be, I think, why only focus on compensations to those who do not benefit from TDCS? Why not also compensate those who do not benefit from, for example, food supplements, yoga, mindfulness, mental training, physical training, etc. Here, the responsiveness varies, of course, across individuals too, because of, for example, metabolism, differences in muscle strength and mental capabilities. So if we allow for these kind of differences, why not allow for the differences when it comes to responsiveness with TDCS? I mean, if we follow Lavasse's way of thought, we could say, well, we should also compensate all athletes who respond bad to food supplements, yoga, mindfulness, mental training, physical training, etc. But that would be even more practical, impossible to test each athlete in what sense they are responsive, in what sense they respond to a certain item or not. And it definitely clashes with how we normally think of fair sports competition. I have a picture here of Usain Bolt. There's no doubt about it that he is born with some genetic qualities, mental qualities, and that he is responding to training, etc., better than other persons. I mean, should other persons then be compensated? Should he start 5 meters, not ahead, but you know, behind the other competitors? No, that would be really problematic. So the work presented here draws on the following work. I've just published this book by Routledge, Doping in Sport and Defense. And so I'm well aware of the fact that there are a lot of, you know, arguments against the use of doping, whether it's neurodoping or non-neurodoping. Thanks. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Actually, you didn't use all your 20 minutes. Thank you, Thomas. We have the time for a couple of questions. Who wants to ask? Wants to start? Or we can, okay. Alexander Eller, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Alex.
Hi, Thomas. Good to see you. Thanks for your talk. Yeah, so I wanted to ask you also, since you, excuse me, you mentioned, you showed your book briefly at the end. I was wondering whether some of the arguments that you cited relating to neurodoping specifically for regulation, how you might have a regulation that would improve fairness while permitting neurodoping in sport. Should we see that as maybe part of a broader argument that you're making about doping in sport? Because one might think that it might be challenging to have regulations of this kind pertaining only to neurodoping if other kinds of enhancement, like say modafinil or fast-acting testosterone or this kind of thing, are banned. And it would seem that, you know, there could be different principles governing different forms of performance enhancement. So at the practical level, do you think this should work more like in a holistic manner as part of a broader argument? Or can neurodoping be regulated?
I'm not quite sure if I understand you, Alex, but my main view is that we should accept a lot of the drugs and methods that can enhance athletes' performance, but only up to a certain level. So I'm not talking about laissez-faire at all. I think we should make sure that when we use these kind of drugs or methods, whether it's in neurodoping or non-neurodoping, we should make sure that we have some safety levels when it comes to each kind of drug. And that actually follows some of the ways that the World Anti-Doping Agency, they work with, for instance, what do you call it, asthma medicine, or, well, at least when it comes to certain kind of medicine, they tolerate that you use some of it, but only up to a certain extent. So I'm definitely in favor of regulation, but regulation that are not that strict compared to the ones that we have right now. And of course, people should be above the age of 18, and it should be monitored by doctors, for instance. But I'm not quite sure if I answered your question, but it was a little bit difficult for me to hear some of what you said, but I got the idea that it has something to do with the regulation and how we should think about that.
Correct. If I may very briefly reformulate my question in one sentence, it was, do you think that the proposal you made for regulating neurodoping could realistically be implemented today in the current state of affairs with the current attitudes towards performance enhancement in sport? Or do you think that some of these attitudes should first be changed to be more liberal or sympathetic to performance enhancement before your proposal could be realistically implemented?
I think it should be changed because, well, if we look at neurodoping right now, TDCS is actually allowed, but the use of cognitive enhancing drugs are not. So I definitely agree with you that we should change the whole way of regulation before we could accept neurodoping like Ritalin and beta blocker, etc. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. There is time to go. There is not much time, so we go directly to the other talk by Jesper Ryberg, also from Roskilde University, whose talk is about neurointervention, crime prevention, and the ideal, non-ideal distinction. Jesper, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Buonasera, and thanks for the opportunity to give a talk this early evening. As just mentioned, the title of my talk is Neurointerventions, Crime Prevention, and the Ideal, Non-Ideal Distinction. And I'll try to be quite brief. I can see we're a little behind schedule. Well, as many of you know, there has, over the last couple of years, been an increasing attention directed to the question of whether it's morally acceptable or perhaps even required to use neurointerventions on offenders as an instrument to prevent future criminal activity. Obviously, there's no simple answer to this question. On the contrary, an answer presupposes initial clarification in various ways. For instance, a first obvious question would be, what kind of neurointerventions are we considering? Neurointerventions cover a wide range of treatment options, varying from drugs, non-invasive techniques such as DMS, to invasive techniques such as DBS or other kinds of brain surgery. Second, when we ask if it's acceptable to use neurointerventions, this is clearly ambiguous. Neurointerventions can be used by being offered to an offender. It can be used in a way that is designed to incentivize an offender to accept the treatment, or it can be used as a compulsory treatment. And obviously, these ways of using neurointerventions give rise to very different ethical considerations. Now, my purpose here is to direct attention to yet another distinction, which I think has been somewhat ignored, but which I also regard as quite important, namely the distinction between ideal and non-ideal considerations. The distinction is well known within political philosophy and is used in somewhat different ways. The way I'll use it here is to distinguish between two types of question or consideration. On the one hand, we can ask whether it would ever be acceptable to use a particular type of neurointervention on offenders. And this is a sort of consideration philosophers are often engaged in. And this is what I would call ideal consideration. On the other hand, we can ask whether it would be acceptable to use neurointerventions in the world as we know it, that is within the criminal justice context that currently exists. In short, this distinction is one between whether it would be acceptable to use neurointerventions in principle or in practice. And these are very different questions. In my view, they're not always clearly distinguished. It sometimes happens that people discuss on the ideal level, and then suddenly jump to considerations that draw on empirical facts about current circumstances under which neurointerventions might be used. And I think that a failure to recognize this distinction have led to some confusion in the discussion of neurointerventions. So let me just give a very brief example. Suppose that theorist A objects to the use of a particular neurointervention on offenders by holding that this would be wrong because it would violate a particular right, and that another theorist B, responds by showing that this need not be the case. The neurointervention can be administered without violating this right. This seems, well, perfectly sound, I think, and it's a very frequent type of exchange. However, if the two discussants are arguing at different levels, then the discussion will be confused. If A is arguing at a non-ideal level, suggesting that if the neurointervention is used, it will in practice violate this right. And if B is arguing at an ideal level by showing that there is a hypothetical case in which the neurointervention need not violate this right, then they are clearly discussing at very different levels and in a confused manner. On closer inspection, B's example would not at all constitute a counter-argument to A, after all. And this is just one example. I believe, as mentioned, that there are many such examples, and then they can be found in the current neuroethical debate. However, what I will do now is to focus on non-ideal considerations of the use of neurointerventions. If we agree that the discussion of neurointerventions should not just be some sort of academic exercise, and that we are interested in delivering genuine action guidance, then at some point, at least, we will have to engage in non-ideal considerations. And this is what I'll try to do now. More precisely, I wish to direct attention to the fact that if we ask whether it's acceptable to use neurointerventions in criminal justice practice, then we are asking whether it would be acceptable to use this technology within a system which is very far from being morally ideal, a system which, ethically speaking, suffers from various sorts of defects. And this, I will argue, may have significant implications for the question of the use of neurointerventions. I believe that many examples can be given, but since the time is limited, I'll restrict myself to 3 examples that will demonstrate what I have in mind here. So let's turn to the first example of a non-ideal consideration. It's generally agreed by theorists that many offenders are today being punished too severely. That is, the criminal sanction is being overused. This is agreed by both by retributivist and consequentialist-minded theorists. Obviously, there are many explanations of why this is the case, but one of the problems which criminologists have pointed at is known as the false positive problem. If the criminal justice system is considering whether there's a risk that an offender will recidivate, then there are 2 types of mistakes that can be made. The first is to send someone to prison or to keep someone in prison for a longer period who would not have committed a crime had he or she been free. And this is what is usually known as a false positive error. It's mistakenly predicted that the offender would have committed a new crime. Second, the other type of mistake would be to fail to send someone to prison or to fail to keep an offender in prison for a longer period who commits a crime that could have been prevented. And this is known, of course, as a false negative error. Now, the false positive problem consists of the fact that decision makers may well react very differently to these 2 types of mistakes. The problem is that while the cost of a false positive is almost invisible and perhaps in a way abstract, the cost of false negatives are immediate and salient. There's an identifiable offender and usually also an identifiable victim. And what criminologists have suggested is that decision makers may well be inclined to overpunish to avoid the risk of false positives, false positive errors that may, for instance, block a re-election campaign or whatever. But if there's such a false positive problem, then it's not difficult to see or to imagine that this could also affect decisions on crime preventive use of neurointerventions. The risk of ending up with a false negative may provide a strong incentive for the criminal justice system to initiate a treatment or keep on treating an offender, even when the person does not constitute a genuine risk. In short, the point is the following. The mechanisms which criminologists have suggested contribute to the overuse of criminal sanctions may well also contribute to overuse, that is, wrongful use of neurointerventions. So this was my first example. Let me then turn to a second example of non-ideal considerations and perhaps a little more simple example. One of the criticisms that has repeatedly been advanced against mass incarceration in the US, but also elsewhere, is that it would, at least for some offenders, be preferable if they were punished in different ways. Rather than placing people behind bars, it would in some cases be better to use, say, community penalties. This would be preferable in terms of crime prevention, and it would be preferable with regard to the way the sanction influences on the life of the offender. Now, if there is a clear tendency, whatever the underlying mechanisms may be, not to choose the type of reaction to crime that is ethically preferable, then this might also constitute a problem in the use of neurointervention as a crime preventive tool. Even if the administration of a type of neurointervention could be justified in principle, it would of course be wrong to use such a treatment if there are alternatives that are preferable by having greater crime preventive effects or by having less deleterious implications for the life of the offender. It might be the case, or it might be that the attractions of neurointerventions, rather than use of well-designed programs designed for resocializations or reintegration of offenders into the community, could lead to morally unacceptable use of neurointerventions in precisely the same way as it is currently the case with regard to the use of standard criminal sanctions, such as imprisonment. So let me turn to the third brief example, and this is quite brief. One of the things that has repeatedly been underlined by criminologists and other theorists is that many criminal justice decisions are not probably academically informed. I remember some years ago, I spoke with Andrew Ashworth from Oxford, and he told me that he does not believe that there has been a single political criminal justice decision in the UK over the last 10 years that has been academically informed. And the same point has, of course, been made in the US. It has been underlined that 3 strikes laws, truth in sentencing, mandatory minimums, and LWOP laws, that is life without parole laws, have been introduced without any sort of cost-benefit studies, impact projections, or other kinds of research findings. What matters is perhaps rather what is politically expedient or popular or whatever. However, it's pretty obvious that proper administration of neurointerventions requires that decision makers in various ways are responsive to scientific information. If this is not the case, then the consequences of introducing such treatment options could be rather terrible, and in various ways, of course. So what is the point of the 3 examples I've outlined here? Well, I think there are 2 points I would like to make. First, when we discuss the use of neurointerventions as a crime preventive instrument, it's important to distinguish between ideal and non-ideal considerations. And that is whether we are considering the in principle question, or whether such intervention should, that is, whether such intervention should ever be used, or whether it should be introduced in practice as part of a criminal justice system as it currently works. Both questions are, of course, important, but it's very important to be absolutely clear about at which level one is discussing. A failure to realize and distinguish these two levels may lead to confused discussions and premature conclusions. Second, I've tried to briefly direct attention to some of the challenges that arise at a non-ideal level. If we ask, would it be morally acceptable to overuse neurointerventions? Then at the ideal level, this is not a question we would consider at all. The answer is obviously in the negative. However, at the non-ideal level, this may be a real concern. If we ask whether neurointerventions should be used if they are preferable alternatives, then this is not something one would ever discuss at an ideal level. The answer is so obviously in the negative. However, this may constitute a genuine problem if we are considering real-life use of neurointerventions. And if we ask whether the administration of neurointerventions should be probably academically informed, then the answer seems so obvious that there's no reason to consider this at an ideal level. However, at a non-ideal level, this may constitute a genuine concern that requires our attention. Discussions at a non-ideal level are in a way more difficult, perhaps, because they require that one is informed about criminology and that one possesses knowledge of the various mechanisms that drive criminal justice practice. But they are important if we do not wish to reduce neuroethics to some sort of academic puzzle solving, but wish to deliver genuine action guidance, which I believe in the end of the day must be the ultimate goal. I think I'll stop here. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jesper. Yes. Are there questions? Let's see. Andrea, is this a question or you are clapping?
Clapping, but I can also make a question if you want.
Yeah, let's go.
Thank you, Jesper, for your talk. It was very insightful. I'm wondering if you consider that neurointervention can be distinguished in that, I mean, not all neurointervention are all the same level. What do you think about your distinction between ideal and not ideal considerations? What the differences among different neurointervention can affect your main argument?
Well, as I said in the beginning, and as you know quite well, there are many different kinds of neurointerventions. But I do not think that the fact that there are these various kinds of neurointerventions plays an important role with regard to the type of distinction I've tried to introduce here in the discussion, namely the distinction between ideal and non-ideal considerations. I mean, no matter what type of neurointerventions we are considering, we have to be clear about whether we are discussing questions such as, would it ever be acceptable to use this kind of considerations? And we can then, if that is the kind of considerations we are engaged in, then we can invent all kind of hypothetical discussions, invent all kind of possible worlds to see, would it be acceptable in this possible world to use this kind of neurointervention and so on. So, and that is kind of ideal considerations. Or we can engage in non-ideal considerations that would it be acceptable in practice to implement or administer these kind of interventions as the criminal justice system works today, or as it would work in the close future and something like that. And I think that this kind of consideration is also relevant, and that is the answer. This distinction is relevant no matter what kind of neurointerventions we are talking about. So I don't think there's any precise relation between types of neurointerventions and the distinction I'm trying to direct focus on here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My turn?
Yes.
Okay, Yeah, I think that the point you're making is, I agree with it, given that ideal interventions are interventions that are merely conceivably morally permissible. But there's another kind of ideal consideration that I wonder where it fits into your classification system, namely, considerations that don't adduce facts about particulars of the situation, but are highly general. For example, someone might argue that neurointerventions are morally impermissible because they violate respect for humanity. Does that count as an ideal consideration? And if that counts as an ideal consideration, it would be relevant in every practical situation as well, right? In every specific situation.
Yeah, well, of course, it can be interpreted in different ways, but as you presented first, well, if you say, well, this kind of neurointervention is wrong because it violates a right or whatever the argument is, then it sounds to me like, I think most philosophers at least would interpret it as an ideal consideration. So it means it does not necessarily only violate this right if it is implemented today in the way the criminal justice works, it just always will violate this kind of right. And that is an ideal consideration and not a non-ideal one.
Okay. Okay, good, I see that.
Thank you very much. Jesper, I'm sorry, but I think we're out of time. So thank you again. A couple of announcements. The next plenary session will be next Thursday at 5 p.m. Italian Central Eastern Time. And now we'll start immediately with the parallel sessions, and the links are in the program that everybody should have. Okay, thank you very much, and see you in the sessions, in the parallel sessions.
Thank you very much.